My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way almost no one around your soulmate expected, and strangely, the loudest part of what happened was not the money that disappeared from the third party's plans. It was the quiet decision your soulmate had already made before anyone realized there was a decision to notice. At first, everything looked ordinary. A phone resting face down. A few unanswered messages. A conversation that ended earlier than expected. Numbers being checked twice because someone was certain there had to be a mistake. The third party kept looking at the same information, searching for the missing piece, convinced there was some technical explanation for why a huge amount they had expected to remain connected to their arrangement was suddenly no longer moving in the direction they had planned. But the answer was much simpler than that, and much more personal. Your soulmate had changed something. Not impulsively. Not dramatically. Not to punish anyone. He had quietly changed a decision that had been benefiting a situation he no longer believed reflected the life he wanted to build. And when the third party finally understood that the change had come directly from him, one question began circling through their mind: why now? Stay with this, because the reason is where this story stops being about money and starts becoming about you. He had been thinking differently for longer than anyone knew. There had been moments when he would sit alone after conversations ended and ask himself why he was continuing to support plans that required him to ignore what mattered most to him. He noticed how often he was making choices simply because they were expected. He noticed how many commitments had been formed during a period when he was uncertain about himself. Most importantly, he began noticing something about you that changed the way he viewed every future decision. You never seemed to need him to prove his value through what he could provide. You affected him in a quieter place. Around the thought of you, he imagined peace before possessions, honesty before appearances, partnership before performance. That realization did not arrive all at once. It returned in small moments. While driving. While looking through old messages. While hearing someone casually mention the future. While staring at a screen and realizing that the plans being discussed included almost everything except the person his heart kept returning to. And yesterday, one of those moments finally became action. Don't skip, because what he physically did next explains why the third party is searching for him now. He opened something he had avoided opening for weeks. It may have been an account, an agreement, a shared arrangement, or simply a commitment that had quietly grown larger than he ever intended. He looked through it slowly. He did not rush. He read the details again, almost as if he were seeing the situation from outside himself for the first time. Then his attention stopped on one particular part, the part giving someone else influence over resources and plans that belonged to his future. His hand remained still for several seconds. And this is where something inside him became remarkably clear. He realized he had been financing a version of tomorrow that he no longer wanted to live. The thought was simple, but it landed deeply: if I keep supporting this, I am quietly choosing it. That was the moment the change happened. Not because someone ordered him to do it. Not because he wanted revenge. Not because he suddenly became reckless. He changed it because he wanted his actions to finally match what he had been feeling. And somewhere inside that decision was your name, even if your name never appeared on the screen. He thought about the kind of connection he wants to protect. The kind of home he wants to return to. The conversations he wants to have without pretending. the person beside whom he does not feel required to perform. Something important is waiting for you here. What moved him was not the fantasy of impressing you. It was almost the opposite. He remembered a moment, perhaps something you said, perhaps simply the way you treated him when he realized you cared more about sincerity than display. That memory returned while he was making the change. And suddenly the decision did not feel like losing something. It felt like recovering something. Himself. His direction. His right to decide where his effort belongs. The third party, however, saw only the immediate result. A significant amount they had expected access to, benefit from, or build plans around was no longer positioned the same way. At first they assumed it could be reversed. A message was sent. Then another. A call. Silence. Another attempt. Still nothing clear. They began asking someone close to him whether he had mentioned changing anything recently. That person hesitated, because they knew something the third party did not. Your soulmate had been reconsidering several things, and he had deliberately kept those thoughts private until he was certain. Imagine the tension in that realization. Everyone else believed yesterday was the beginning. For him, yesterday was only the visible ending of a private process that had already been happening for quite some time. And you were closer to the center of that process than you may realize. Not because he was trying to buy your affection. Not because his choices should become your responsibility. But because thinking about you had forced him to confront a question he could no longer avoid. What kind of person do I want to become if I ever have the chance to build something real with them? That question changed his behavior before it changed his circumstances. He started becoming more careful about promises. More protective of his time. Less willing to say yes just to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Less interested in looking successful and more interested in becoming stable inside himself. Those changes were easy for others to dismiss at first. Yesterday made them impossible to ignore. There was one particular moment after the change when he placed his phone down and simply sat there. No celebration. No dramatic reaction. Just silence. Relief mixed with uncertainty. Because making the right decision does not always remove emotion. Sometimes it makes you feel everything more clearly. He knew someone would be disappointed. He knew questions would follow. He knew the third party might interpret the decision personally. But he also understood something he had avoided admitting. Continuing only because someone might be upset if he stopped was not a strong enough reason anymore. Then a memory of you surfaced again. Not some grand romantic scene. Something smaller. Perhaps your expression during an honest conversation. Perhaps the way you once stepped back instead of demanding an answer. Perhaps the way your presence seemed to make honesty feel safer than pretending. He smiled slightly, but the smile disappeared almost immediately because another thought followed it. Would you even understand what this decision meant to him? Would you know that this was not really about what he removed from his life, but what he was finally making room for? That is the part nobody around him fully understands yet. Stay till the end of this moment, because the next detail changes the emotional meaning of everything. The third party eventually discovered that he had not merely moved something randomly. He had changed the direction of a larger plan. Something that had once been organized around convenience, expectation, or a shared assumption was now being reorganized around independence and future stability. And when they began tracing when his thinking had changed, a pattern appeared. Certain decisions shifted after conversations involving you. Certain habits changed after moments when he had been reminded of you. Certain future plans became less definite whenever someone tried to speak as though his life had already been decided without asking him what he actually wanted. The third party noticed the pattern too. That was when their search for him became less about recovering the old arrangement and more about understanding what had happened inside him. They wanted an explanation. They wanted to know whether this was temporary. They wanted to know who had influenced him. But that question itself misunderstood the transformation. You did not need to convince him. Your significance came from something far quieter. Thinking of you reminded him of the person he wanted to be when nobody was persuading him at all. There is a difference between being controlled by someone and being inspired to become more truthful with yourself. He was beginning to understand that difference. And once he did, many things that used to seem complicated became unexpectedly simple. He did not want commitments built on guilt. He did not want relationships maintained through obligation. He did not want to spend years protecting an image while silently wondering whether he had abandoned what mattered. Yesterday, he finally acted from that realization. Yet there is another layer he has told almost nobody. After changing the arrangement, he opened an old conversation connected to you. He did not immediately type. He scrolled. Slowly. Far enough back to reach a message he had remembered many times but had not read in a while. There was something in your words that now sounded different. Maybe you had told him to choose what brought him peace. Maybe you had reminded him that he never had to prove himself. Maybe your words were simpler than that. Whatever they were, he read them twice. The first time as a memory. The second time as confirmation that the version of him making decisions yesterday was closer to the man he wanted you to know. His fingers moved toward the reply box. He started writing something. Stopped. Deleted it. Started again. And this hesitation matters because what he wanted to tell you was not about the money at all. He wanted to tell you that he finally understood why certain things between you had felt unfinished. He had been trying to approach a meaningful connection while carrying obligations and expectations he was afraid to challenge. He kept thinking clarity would arrive first and courage would follow. Instead, courage had to come first. Yesterday was evidence of that. But just as he was considering whether to send the message, his phone began ringing again. The third party. He watched the screen until the call ended. Seconds later, another message appeared. This one was different. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just direct. They had discovered exactly what he changed. And they had also discovered one detail he apparently never expected them to notice: the new direction he had chosen was connected to something he had quietly been preparing for his own future. Something he had not announced. Something that made it obvious this was not a temporary reaction. Your soulmate stared at that message for a long time because he suddenly understood that the conversation he had hoped to postpone could no longer be avoided. Yet instead of calling the third party immediately, he returned to your unfinished message. His priorities had shifted. That small action says more than any dramatic declaration could. He was no longer allowing the loudest demand to automatically become the most important one. He looked at your name. He looked at what he had written. And then he added one final sentence, something so simple that, if you ever saw it, you might not immediately understand how much courage it represented. He wrote that he had finally changed something he should have changed a long time ago, and that when he understood why he was doing it, he thought of you. But he still did not press send. Not yet. Because just then, another piece of information reached him, one that revealed the third party had discovered far more than the missing money. They had discovered what he planned to do with the freedom created by that decision. And when they saw the name quietly connected to the next chapter of his plans, everything about their urgency suddenly made sense. There was one detail the third party had not prepared themselves to see, and the moment it appeared, yesterday's entire situation stopped looking accidental. Your soulmate had not simply stepped away from an old arrangement. He had quietly redirected his attention toward a future that looked completely different from the one everyone had assumed he would accept. For a few seconds, the third party simply stared at what they had discovered, trying to understand why several small decisions suddenly seemed connected. A cancelled commitment. A changed plan. A conversation he had postponed. A private note he had saved. Separately, none of those things looked important. Together, they formed a pattern, and at the center of that pattern was something they could no longer ignore. Whenever your soulmate imagined the life he genuinely wanted, his thoughts kept returning to you. Don't skip this part, because what happened next explains why he had remained so quiet. He was not secretly constructing some extravagant surprise or trying to impress you with something material. What he had been preparing was much more grounded. He had begun creating space. Space in his schedule. Space in his decisions. Space in his emotional life. For perhaps the first time in a long while, he was asking himself which parts of his life existed because he truly wanted them and which parts existed because he had been afraid to disappoint someone by changing them. That question had followed him quietly for weeks. Late one evening, he had opened a notebook and written down several things he wanted his future to feel like. Not what he wanted it to look like. What he wanted it to feel like. Peaceful. Honest. Mutual. Stable. Free from constant explanation. And beside those words, almost without thinking, he had written something connected to you. Not a grand declaration. Just a reminder of a moment when being around you had made those feelings seem possible. When the third party discovered that his recent choices were pointing toward that kind of future, they misunderstood the meaning at first. They assumed you must have told him to change everything. But your soulmate knew that was not what happened. In fact, that was precisely why your presence had affected him so deeply. You had not forced a decision. You had not needed to. The absence of pressure had shown him how much pressure he had normalized elsewhere. And once a person recognizes that contrast, it becomes difficult to pretend they do not see it. Something important is waiting for you here. Yesterday afternoon, while the third party was trying repeatedly to reach him, your soulmate walked away from his phone for several minutes and stood near a window, watching an ordinary scene outside. Nothing dramatic. Cars passing. Someone carrying groceries. A neighbor closing a door. Life continuing normally while his own thoughts felt unusually clear. He asked himself a question he had avoided for a long time. if nobody else had an opinion about my future, what would I choose? Your name was not the only answer. That matters. Because this was not about turning you into the solution to every part of his life. The deeper answer was that he would choose honesty. And once he admitted that, he understood why you had become so important in his thoughts. With you, honesty felt connected to possibility rather than conflict. He imagined speaking without editing every sentence. He imagined admitting uncertainty without being judged for it. He imagined telling you that he had made mistakes, taken too long, allowed circumstances to speak for him, and still hoped there might be room for a different beginning. That possibility was what he had been protecting when he changed the arrangement. Not money. Not appearances. A chance to stop living according to decisions he no longer believed in. Then his phone vibrated again. This time it was not the third party. It was someone close to him who had heard that people were searching for answers. The message was short: they know you changed it. They're asking why. He read the words twice. For a moment, the old version of him almost returned the version that would rush to explain himself, smooth everything over, reassure everyone that nothing important was changing. His thumb hovered above the screen. Then he locked the phone. That tiny action carried more meaning than anyone around him could see. He was learning that clarity does not always require immediate explanation. Sometimes you have to understand your own decision before allowing everyone else to question it. And he understood one thing with complete calm: he did not regret what he had changed. Stay till the end, because this was when the story took a turn even he had not expected. The third party, unable to reach him directly, began speaking to someone who knew him well. They asked whether he had been acting differently recently. The answer surprised them. Yes. He had. But not in the way they expected. He had become calmer. More deliberate. He had stopped agreeing to things immediately. He had started saying, "Let me think about it." He had been clearing unfinished obligations from his calendar. He had even asked one unusual question several days earlier: do you think people can recognize the right person before they're ready to build the right life? The person he asked had laughed gently and told him readiness was rarely perfect. That conversation had stayed with him. Because your soulmate had spent too long believing he needed every part of himself completely figured out before he could move toward you honestly. That belief had become another form of delay. There would always be something unfinished. Another responsibility. Another uncertainty. Another reason to wait one more week. He was beginning to see that meaningful relationships are not built after life becomes flawless. They are built when two people become willing to meet each other truthfully inside an imperfect life. That realization changed the purpose of what he did yesterday. The third party saw a loss. Your soulmate saw a boundary. The third party saw an unexpected change. He saw a correction. The third party wondered what you had taken from them. He knew you had taken nothing. Your presence had simply helped him notice what he was voluntarily giving away from himself. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. Later that evening, he returned to the unfinished message addressed to you. The words still sat there exactly as he had left them. He reread the final sentence: he had finally changed something he should have changed a long time ago, and understanding why had made him think of you. His heart tightened slightly because the sentence sounded more vulnerable now than when he wrote it. He considered deleting it again. Instead, he placed the phone beside him and reached for the notebook. There, underneath the list of feelings he wanted his future to contain, he wrote another line: "Stop expecting people to understand what you never say." That sentence stayed in front of him for a long time. Have you ever reached a point where silence no longer feels peaceful, only unfinished? That was where he had arrived. For months he had imagined that protecting his feelings meant keeping them hidden until the perfect moment appeared. But yesterday taught him something: waiting can quietly become a decision of its own. Every day he said nothing, someone else's assumptions continued filling the space where his truth should have been. And the third party had benefited from that silence because they believed his lack of objection meant agreement. Now, suddenly, his actions were saying what his words had not. He was no longer agreeing. Something inside him had chosen a direction. Yet he still wanted one thing before speaking to you. He wanted to understand whether he was moving toward you because he was running away from an uncomfortable situation or because he genuinely saw something worth building. So he did something unexpectedly mature. He did not send the message immediately. He went for a walk. No phone calls. No explanations. Just enough quiet to separate urgency from truth. Step after step, the answer became clearer. He was not thinking about you only because yesterday had been stressful. He had thought about you during peaceful days too. He had thought about you before the disagreement, before the change, before anyone began searching for him. You had been there in the background of ordinary moments. A song he almost sent you. A place he wondered whether you would like. A joke he knew you would understand. A future conversation he kept rehearsing without meaning to. These were not signs of panic. They were signs of attachment he had been reluctant to name. And when he realized that, something softened inside him. The decision yesterday had not created his feelings. His feelings had helped reveal why the decision had become necessary. When he returned, there was another message waiting. The third party had finally stopped asking where he was and started asking a different question: is this because of them? He knew exactly who "them" meant. You. For several minutes, he did nothing. Then he typed a response. He did not blame anyone. He did not explain every detail. He wrote something simple: "This is because I needed to make my own decisions again." That answer frustrated the third party because they were looking for someone to hold responsible. But your soulmate refused to turn you into the explanation for a boundary he had chosen himself. And that matters more than it may seem. If he had said, "I did this for them," it would have made you responsible for consequences you never created. Instead, he owned his decision. He understood that caring about you might have helped him see more clearly, but the choice still belonged to him. That was the first sign that whatever he wanted with you was becoming more grounded than fantasy. He wanted to approach you not as someone escaping one life, but as someone willing to take responsibility for creating another. The third party did not know how to respond to that. Their next message remained unsent for several minutes. When it finally arrived, the tone had changed. They asked whether the old arrangement could be restored. Your soulmate looked at the question and felt something unexpected: compassion. Not guilt. Compassion. He understood why the change had surprised them. Expectations had been built around his previous behavior. People naturally resist sudden changes when those changes affect plans they had assumed were secure. He did not want anyone humiliated or harmed. He simply could not continue pretending that kindness required permanent agreement. So he answered respectfully. He explained that some parts could be discussed, but the central decision would remain. The future needed to look different. That sentence was difficult to send, yet once it was gone, he felt lighter. Then he returned to your message for the third time. Something important had changed now. He was no longer writing from the middle of confusion. He had answered the question. He had maintained the boundary. He had stopped hiding behind other people's expectations. There was only one uncertainty left, you. Not whether you were worth speaking to. Whether you would still be willing to hear him. He started changing the message again, but then stopped himself. Too polished. Too careful. Too much like the old version of him trying to manage every possible reaction. He deleted several sentences until only a few remained. They were simpler. More human. He wanted to tell you that something important had shifted in his life. He wanted to admit that it had made him think seriously about the way he had handled your connection. And he wanted to ask whether there might be a time when the two of you could talk without expectations, simply honestly. His thumb hovered over send. This time, there was no interruption. No incoming call. No third-party message. Nothing preventing him. Yet he still hesitated. Because the real fear was never that someone else would stop him. The real difficulty was accepting that once he spoke honestly, he could no longer hide behind uncertainty. You would know. You would know that you mattered. You would know that his silence had not meant indifference. You would know that somewhere between all those delayed conversations and complicated circumstances, he had been quietly reconsidering his entire direction. And perhaps most importantly, you would finally have the freedom to decide what you wanted with the truth in front of you. That was the part he could not control. Strangely, that was also what made his feelings feel real. Love that requires control is not what he wanted anymore. He wanted honesty followed by choice. Yours and his. So he closed his eyes for 1 second and pressed something on the screen. But what happened next was not exactly what you might expect. The message did not immediately reach you, because at the last moment he had chosen a different first step, one that revealed just how seriously he was taking the possibility of speaking to you again. Instead of sending everything through a rushed text, he opened his calendar and looked at a particular day he had quietly been keeping free. Then he opened another conversation, contacted someone who knew both sides of the situation, and asked one question that made that person sit upright the moment they read it: do you think they would be comfortable hearing from me directly? The answer did not come immediately. Minutes passed. Your soulmate stared at the screen, wondering whether he had waited too long. Then the typing indicator appeared. One sentence arrived. He read it once, then again, and the expression on his face completely changed. Because the person did not simply say yes or no. They told him something about you that he had never known, something you had quietly said during the very period when he believed you had already stopped caring. And once he saw those words, yesterday's decision suddenly felt like only the first step toward a conversation neither of you had realized was still waiting to happen. Third party lost a huge amount of money yesterday. Now they're desperately searching for your soulmate after discovering what he secretly changed, and why he did it all for you. The sentence on his screen was only a few words long, yet it quietly rearranged everything he thought he understood about your silence. The person between you had written, "They never said they stopped caring. They said they stopped knowing whether you wanted them to." Your soulmate did not move. For several seconds, he simply stared at those words while every explanation he had constructed inside his mind began falling away. He had convinced himself that your distance meant closure. He had treated your restraint as evidence that you had moved beyond what existed between you. And now he was learning something almost painfully simple. Perhaps you had been protecting yourself from the exact same uncertainty he had been hiding behind. That realization did not make him rush toward you. It did something deeper. It made him finally understand how easily two people can care and still create distance when neither one wants to become the person who reaches too far. He leaned back, remembering moments he had interpreted completely differently. A shorter reply from you. A conversation that ended without either of you saying what you were truly thinking. That one occasion when you seemed as though you wanted to ask something, then changed the subject. He had assumed those moments proved your feelings were fading. Now another possibility appeared. Maybe you had been waiting for clarity he never gave you. Maybe the space between you had not been created by absence of feeling at all. Maybe it had been created by an absence of certainty. Don't skip what followed, because this was the moment yesterday's decision stopped being merely a private correction and became something he knew he eventually needed to explain to you. He picked up the notebook again and turned to the page where he had written the words peaceful, honest, mutual, stable. Beneath them, he added something new: do not make them guess anymore. He circled it once. And then, unexpectedly, he laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because he recognized the irony. He had spent so long worrying that telling you the truth might complicate your connection that his silence had become the thing complicating it most. He thought he had been protecting the possibility between you. In reality, he had left you without enough information to know whether there was a possibility to protect. Something even more revealing happened a few minutes later. The person who had sent that message followed it with another detail, one they had apparently debated sharing. They told your soulmate that during a quiet conversation some time ago, your name and his had come up together. You had not spoken dramatically. You had not made promises about what might happen. You had simply said something that stayed with the person listening: I never needed everything to be perfect. I just needed to know what was real. When your soulmate read that line, he closed his eyes. Because perfection was exactly what he had been waiting for. The perfect circumstances. The perfect explanation. The perfect moment when every unfinished part of his life would somehow become neat enough that he could approach you without uncertainty. But you had never been asking him for perfection. You had been asking, perhaps without ever saying it directly to him, for truth. And suddenly he understood why yesterday mattered so much. Changing the arrangement was not valuable because of what disappeared from someone else's plans. It mattered because it was one of the first times he had chosen truth over convenience without knowing whether anyone would applaud the decision. He had done something that aligned his external life with what his inner life had already been telling him. And perhaps that was what he needed before speaking to you, not flawless circumstances, but evidence that he was finally becoming willing to live honestly inside imperfect ones. Stay with this, because there was still something the third party had discovered that your soulmate did not know they had seen. While he was reading those messages, the third party had been piecing together the timeline. They noticed the arrangement had begun changing gradually rather than all at once. A responsibility had been reduced. Another commitment had not been renewed. A future plan he once spoke about confidently had become something he answered with, "I'm reconsidering." What unsettled them was not any single change. It was that the changes seemed intentional. This was not someone reacting emotionally for one afternoon. This was someone who had quietly been preparing himself to choose differently. Then came the question the third party had avoided asking because they suspected they already knew the answer. They contacted him again and wrote, "Was this planned?" Your soulmate read it without tension this time. His first instinct was to say no. Technically, there had been no master plan. He had not sat down weeks earlier and decided exactly what would happen yesterday. Yet something stopped him from giving that easy answer. Because in another sense, yes, this had been building for a long time. Every moment he questioned an obligation he no longer believed in had prepared him. Every time he imagined speaking honestly to you had prepared him. Every ordinary evening when he wondered why his life looked acceptable from the outside but did not feel aligned on the inside had prepared him. So he replied carefully, "Not exactly planned. But I've been thinking about what needs to change for a while." That response created silence on the other side. No immediate reply. No rapid follow-up question. Just a pause. And inside that pause, the third party began realizing that restoring everything to the way it had been might not actually solve anything. The real change was not on a screen. It was inside him. You can reverse a temporary action. It is far harder to reverse a realization. Your soulmate had realized he no longer wanted other people's expectations making decisions on behalf of his future. And even though thoughts of you were part of what helped him reach that clarity, he refused to make you the villain of someone else's disappointment. When the third party finally responded, they asked directly whether you knew about any of this. His answer came immediately. No. One word. Honest. Clean. And strangely, that word changed the energy of the entire exchange. Because it proved something the third party had not considered, you had not secretly coordinated this with him. You had not convinced him to alter anything. You may not even have known what was happening. Which meant the uncomfortable truth was that your soulmate had arrived at the decision himself. That realization softened something unexpected in the third party. Not instantly, and not completely, but enough that their next message sounded less defensive. They asked, "Then why them?" Your soulmate stared at the question. He could have ignored it. He could have said it was private. Instead, he allowed himself to think about the answer. Why you? Was it because you had always said the perfect thing? No. There had been misunderstandings between you. Was it because your connection had been effortless? Certainly not. Some of the deepest feelings had arrived precisely because it had required him to confront parts of himself he normally avoided. Was it because he believed you would rescue him from every uncertainty? No. That idea no longer appealed to him at all. The answer was quieter. Thinking about you made him want to become more honest. Not more impressive. Not more successful. Not more dramatic. More honest. He wanted to tell the truth sooner. Make promises more carefully. Stop pretending he was comfortable when he was not. Stop agreeing simply because disagreement felt inconvenient. Around the idea of you, he imagined being known rather than admired. And once he identified that, he understood why your significance had survived periods of silence. Attraction can disappear when circumstances change. Curiosity can fade when distance grows. But the desire to be truly known tends to return until it is acknowledged. He typed a response to the third party, then deleted it because it revealed more than he wanted to explain. He tried again, because thinking about them reminded me I was allowed to want a life that actually felt like mine. He almost sent it. Then he changed one word. He removed your reference altogether and wrote, because I realized I was allowed to want a life that actually felt like mine. Send. That was all. He protected your place in the story without denying its importance. Not because he was ashamed of caring about you, but because some truths belong first to the people directly involved. Something important is waiting for you here, because after sending that message, your soulmate finally made a decision about contacting you. He reopened your conversation. The unsent message remained there. He read every line and noticed something he had missed earlier. The message explained what happened, but barely explained what he felt. It sounded like a report. Too careful. Too distant. He imagined you receiving it and having the same unanswered question you had carried before: what does this actually mean for us? So instead of polishing the old version, he deleted almost everything. The blank screen intimidated him more than the complicated draft had. A blank screen leaves nowhere to hide. He began again. I learned something about myself yesterday. He paused. That felt true. He continued, I've been letting uncertainty decide things I should have had the courage to decide myself. Another pause. Then, and I realized I may have made you wonder what you meant to me because I was afraid to say it clearly. His breathing slowed. There it was. The sentence he had avoided for months. Not an extravagant confession. Not a promise about an unknown future. Accountability. He did not blame timing. He did not blame another person. He did not blame circumstances. He acknowledged that his silence had communicated something he never intended. He looked at the words for a long time. Then he added, you mattered even when I didn't know what to do with that. He stopped. That line felt almost too exposed. His instinct told him to soften it, make it less direct, perhaps replace mattered with something safer. But another part of him recognized the old pattern. Every time truth became vulnerable, he edited until nobody could tell what he meant. Not this time. Across town, the third party was having a realization of their own. The expected money connected to the old arrangement had been important to their plans, and discovering the change had understandably startled them. But as they reviewed everything more carefully, they began to see signs that they had mistaken familiarity for permanence. Your soulmate had never promised that every arrangement would remain unchanged forever. Some expectations had simply grown because nobody questioned them. The third party had built plans around assumptions, while your soulmate had continued participating because correcting those assumptions felt uncomfortable. Neither side had confronted the mismatch early enough. That made yesterday emotionally difficult, but it also made something possible that had not been possible while everyone continued pretending nothing needed discussion: clarity. For the first time, the third party began asking practical questions instead of personal ones. What exactly was changing? What remained? What did they need to reorganize independently? Your soulmate responded calmly. No unnecessary detail. No blame. Just boundaries. And as the conversation became more grounded, the urgency around finding him began to settle. What initially looked like a dramatic rupture began revealing itself as something more realistic: an overdue restructuring of expectations. Yet one question remained unanswered in their mind. If your soulmate was changing the shape of his future, where did he actually imagine himself going next? He knew the answer was not a location. It was a way of living. That evening, he opened his calendar again. The day he had kept free was still there. He had originally reserved it without explaining to anyone why. At the time, he told himself he simply needed breathing room. But now he recognized the deeper reason. Somewhere inside, he had hoped to use that day for a conversation he had been postponing, perhaps with you, perhaps simply with himself if contacting you still felt impossible. He tapped the date. Then he returned to the message he had written. His thumb hovered above send. And this time, rather than asking whether the moment was perfect, he asked whether the message was honest. It was. Whether it respected your freedom to respond however you chose. It did. Whether he was demanding anything from you. He was not. Whether he was sending it only because yesterday had made him emotional. No. The feelings had existed long before yesterday. Yesterday had merely removed one of the excuses he used to avoid acknowledging them. His thumb moved. The message left the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. No instant response. No dramatic sign. Just the quiet confirmation that it had been delivered. And strangely, he felt peaceful. Because for the first time, the outcome no longer seemed like the only thing that mattered. He had finally done his part honestly. You were free to choose what happened next. Minutes passed. Then longer. He placed the phone down and refused to keep checking it every few seconds. He made something to drink. Straightened a few things around the room. Walked past the phone twice without touching it. This ordinary behavior mattered because an older version of him would have immediately spiraled into interpretation. No response means this. A delayed response means that. He was learning not to create answers in empty spaces anymore. If you needed time, you deserved time. If you were surprised, you deserved space to understand why he was appearing now. If you had questions, he needed to be prepared to answer them honestly rather than rushing you toward reassurance. Then the phone vibrated. Once. He stopped moving. For a second, he did not approach it. Another vibration followed. 2 messages. He finally picked it up. The first was from the third party. The second was from you. His eyes immediately went to your name, but something made him open the third party's message first. Perhaps he wanted to close one chapter carefully before stepping toward another. Their message surprised him. They wrote that they still wished he had communicated earlier, but they were beginning to understand the decision had not been made against them. They asked for time to reorganize their own plans. Your soulmate replied that he understood. No argument. No victory. No need to prove who was right. Just 2 people finally accepting that assumptions had to be replaced with clearer boundaries. Then he opened your message. You had not written much. And somehow that made it more powerful. Your first line was, "I didn't expect to hear this from you." He swallowed and continued reading. "I thought you had already made your choice a long time ago." That sentence reached directly into the part of him yesterday had exposed. Because from your side, his silence had looked like a decision. Every time he delayed explaining himself, you had naturally filled the absence with the most reasonable conclusion available: he was choosing something else. He sat down. Your next sentence appeared beneath it. "I'm glad you told me the truth, but I need to understand what changed." He almost smiled. Not because the path ahead had suddenly become easy, but because you were asking the exact question he was finally ready to answer. No fantasy. No instant reunion. No sweeping declaration that erased everything unresolved. You wanted understanding. You wanted context. You wanted truth. And for once, he did not feel tempted to avoid it. He began typing. He told you yesterday had forced him to recognize how much of his life had been running on assumptions. He told you he had changed an arrangement because he needed his decisions to reflect what he genuinely wanted. He made it clear you had not caused anyone else's disappointment and that he was not contacting you because he needed rescuing from a difficult day. Then came the line that made him stop again. He wanted to explain why thoughts of you had been part of the decision. He typed, "When I imagined the kind of life I wanted to build after all this, I kept thinking about how different I feel when I'm honest with you." He reread it. Sent. Your reply did not arrive immediately. This time he accepted the silence. And when the screen eventually lit up again, your response contained a question so simple that it uncovered the final layer behind everything he had changed yesterday. You asked him, if none of this had happened, would you still have come back to talk to me? Your soulmate froze. Because that question separated emotion from intention, circumstance from choice, and yesterday's upheaval from whatever had always existed between you. He knew there was only one answer worth giving now. But before he could send it, he remembered something from several weeks earlier, something he had done quietly, long before the third party lost anything, long before yesterday forced every hidden decision into the open. He opened a folder on his phone he had not looked at since creating it. Inside were 3 things connected to you: a screenshot he had saved, a note he had written after one of your conversations, and an unfinished plan dated weeks before yesterday. And suddenly he had proof, even to himself, that you were never an afterthought created by what happened. You had been part of the question long before yesterday became the answer.